Thank you. Thank you, Damon, for the great introduction. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for being here. It's great having you here. And thank you all to our esteemed guests for spending your Sunday morning with us, and you're not brunching with your friends in Thessaloniki, famous for its food. Michael, as Damien kindly introduced him, has a fascinating and really diverse background. You grew up in Columbia, South Carolina in a Greek family. You went on to Princeton, and you worked in banking and finance prior to moving to Silicon Valley to join Thiel Capital as principal and then chief of staff to Peter Thiel himself, and where you advised and invested on technology companies. So let's just dive right in, shall we? And my first question is, how did you move from the technology world to the policy world? What were your experiences like, your challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here and including me. I'm always delighted to come back from Greece, to Greece. Η μητέρα μου είναι από τη Χίο και ο πατέρας μου από τη Καστοριά και κάθε φορά που ήρθα στην Ελλάδα μου αρέσει τόσο πολύ και ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Αλλά back to English. For me, I think we had been, I was in Silicon Valley for almost 7 years working in the startup world, and I think what we started to see over the last 3 or 4 years before I moved to DC was a much more interested focus among investors on the regulatory angle associated with all of our portfolio companies. We were invested in everything from Airbnb and SpaceX to Palantir to Stripe, and in all of these startups, there always seemed to be a higher and higher interest among ourselves in sort of researching what the regulatory hurdles were, whether it was SpaceX trying to get launches, whether it was Palantir having issues with the federal government on procurement, whether it was Airbnb and the challenges they were having on the local level. And having the opportunity to be able to actually work in government and clear those regulatory hurdles, so our greatest innovators and startups can actually commercialize their product, was something that I found extraordinarily compelling. So having that chance to do it in Washington was really what drove me
right.
there.
Regulation you just mentioned with SpaceX, we'll have a question about space later on. I just want to refer to it right now. Let me touch a little bit on regulation and regulatory environment. In your Wall Street Journal profile back in November 2017, you were quoted as saying, and let me just read from my notes here, quote, "Seeing an opportunity to boost entrepreneurship in American cities outside of Silicon Valley, such as creating incentives for venture capital investors and to nurture agricultural technology companies in places like Omaha, Nebraska." Can you speak about why you feel it's important for the American entrepreneurship and economy at large, and specifically about technology innovation to diversify beyond Silicon Valley, and what can the government do to help that?
Yeah, absolutely. When we sort of set any sort of priorities at the White House, we always begin with kind of the higher level priorities of the president. And to him, I think the three key priorities are: 1, economic growth and jobs; 2 is government reform; and 3 is national security. And for us, as we try to channel that into a technology agenda, if we want to continue driving tremendous economic growth and job creation in the United States, the technology sector is going to be absolutely pivotal to that. The greatest growth in the U.S. Has come from technology over the last 20 years, and it will continue. Now, in order for that to happen, we have to realize that it doesn't only happen in a few cities. Currently in the U.S., as many of you know, the venture capital market is very, very concentrated. Something in the neighborhood of 70% of all venture dollars either end up in San Francisco, New York, or Boston. And we're leaving a lot on the table as Americans. And there's a ton of amazing talent, ideas, and opportunity across the country where we really want to tap into that. And in some ways, I really see that as a correlative we can think about in the context of Greece as well. It is not just hubs like London or Berlin who may have startups in Europe. There are a lot of untapped potential across Europe, including here in Thessaloniki and in Athens, that we need to do a better job of surfacing and cultivating, and that can ultimately lead to the important economic growth and jobs.
Well, yeah, in Europe we've seen that. It's much more decentralized than U.S. We have Berlin, Paris and London, and hopefully Athens will be included in that list a couple of years now. Now, let me follow up with the same journal profile. It was very rich in content. You were also quoted, and I quote, "It's just a question of putting smart people around a table and trying to come up with an innovative approach to regulating new technologies."
Yeah.
What is your general philosophy toward regulating such emerging technologies? Are we in danger, do you think, of losing out our competitive edge or new innovations?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we constantly talk about in our office, our number one priority is promoting emerging technologies in the U.S. And this really hits on those top two important themes I discussed from the president, the economic growth and jobs and regulatory reform question. So when we want to think about emerging tech, what does that mean? That means that the next generation of important technologies which are going to drive economic growth, how are they faring in the U.S.? Are they making it? And I think the one example that we talk a lot about publicly is around drones. And the reason we do is not because I have a personal obsession with drones, even though I kind of do. The reality is that this is a great example of an industry that the technology exists, but the regulatory apparatus to allow it to succeed does not. So it was many years ago that Jeff Bezos had a very famous Super Bowl commercial where he showed a drone delivery of an Amazon package to someone's backyard. And the entire country was suddenly excited. They were no longer, they could have packages delivered every afternoon to their houses. But the reality is that has not happened. In the U.S., it is currently illegal to fly commercial drones over people beyond visual line of sight or at night. And that hasn't changed for years now. Yet changing those rules is going to be absolutely pivotal to having that entire commercial industry take off. So for us, we constantly are looking at emerging technologies and what the regulatory hurdles are to their development. So in the case of drones, we're working very closely with the FAA in order to fix the rules so we can actually do innovative testing of drone operations and actually try package delivery, try beyond visual line of sight pipe inspection, allow firefighters and first responders to have access to drones, be able to reach car accidents before ambulances can, and so on. This extends to other emerging technologies. Autonomous vehicles is another great example. This technology continues to develop, but the rules around autonomous vehicles don't exist. The U.S. likes to think it has been sort of the most forward-leaning country in the world around automobile regulations broadly. The issue is that these rules were crafted around a vehicle that has a steering wheel, has a brake pedal, has mirrors, has lights, all these features that are baked into the regulatory structure. Now, we're coming to a point where even at last year's CES, GM said they're going to have a completely driverless car with no steering wheel available for production in 2019. It is impossible for that particular vehicle to actually make it on the road because it doesn't have a steering wheel, it doesn't have a brake pedal, it doesn't have a gas pedal, and the problem is we don't have rules to accommodate that. So we're spending a lot of time with the Department of Transportation. Our Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Chow, has been very forward-leaning on it, and we continue to try to put out non-regulatory guidance on how states can really think about pushing these technologies. Right. So whether it's drones or cars or anything else, we're relentlessly focused on figuring out what the regulatory hurdles are to the deployment of those technologies to the American consumer.
Speaking of drones, let me follow up. You were like the point person of the White House Drone Initiative.
Yeah.
To integrate them in the national airspace system. What do you think are the next steps required after improving on the 2016 FAA rules?
Yeah. So I think in the drone example, we see where it was a really one of those wake-up call moments for a lot of regulators, where attempting to integrate unmanned aircraft into a manned aircraft system is actually really, really, really hard. The FAA has been working to make air travel for Americans the safest that it possibly could be for a very, very long time. One stat I like to talk about is I think it took in the neighborhood of almost 80 years to have over 200,000 registered manned aircraft with the FAA. It took the FAA less than 3 years to have nearly 1 million drones registered. So the scale and the pace of this is absolutely incredible. So we made the decision rather than, I think, in the years prior to our administration, there had been a lot of focus on just trying to create the one rule that would solve it all. The one rule that would say, okay, now it's going to be fine and you can do all these operations with drones. Our take was, It's actually really hard to do that, and we need the data to be able to inform the policymakers in Washington on how the integration should happen. So the president signed a presidential memorandum, or similar to an executive order, that created a drone pilot program. And this was an opportunity for state, local, and tribal leaders to apply to the federal government and say, we want to try this innovative operation. We want to try package delivery. We want to try pipeline inspections. We want to try first responder drone activities. And in each of those cases, we were able to give them approval for special waivers. And through that activity, we'll get a better understanding of how these aircraft interact with the American people. Maybe in the town of Omaha, it's fine to have package deliveries at 3 p.m. every afternoon, but that's not what's going to be happening in Manhattan, for example. So we can't have one rule that works for the entire United States. We really need the state, local, and tribal involvement in building that up.
Right, exactly. And it's part of the, as well-known federalism in the United States. Now, another project you're hands-on in the White House is space travel. Let's go on a higher altitude than drones. We see that venture capital investment in space is soaring. Biggest example yet, as you mentioned in your introduction, SpaceX. VCs bet that once space becomes profitable, it will become routine, and perhaps incremental profitability will ultimately outlast the national prestige as the sole or long-term driver of space exploration. Now, how do you plan for the United States government to utilize space travel and to anticipate if these new business models work out?
Yeah, so I think the president has had an incredible focus on space. So he revitalized the National Space Council. It's led by our vice president, so Vice President Pence is the chair of it. And for us, I think, if you ever have an opportunity to hear Wilbur Ross talk about space, it's something that he at the Commerce Department is extraordinarily excited about. The pace of innovation around space has been absolutely breathtaking. We're at the point where SpaceX likely by next year is going to be doing one launch a week, which is just an incredible, incredible pace. But if you think about that, that sounds all well and good, but somehow the federal government has to clear every launch, right? And that requires coordination by the FAA, by the Department of Commerce, and all the other authorities to clear the airspace and have a safe travel to space. So the administration realized that and has put a very, very heavy emphasis on creating essentially a one-stop shop for the approval of commercial space operations. And this is going to be housed at the Department of Commerce. Secretary Ross is extremely enthusiastic about bringing all the disparate components from various agencies under one roof at the Department of Commerce. And for us, I think this is a huge step. And but what's important to remember is it's not only a private sector initiative, and it doesn't mean that just because there's really great success at Blue Origin, at SpaceX, and other companies, that NASA is not going to continue with its incredible work. There have been 3 space policy directives that the president has signed. One of them discusses this consolidation of regulatory apparatus at Commerce, but another big, the first space policy directive was around taking man back to the moon. So that's an initiative that is being undertaken by NASA, and it's something that for the betterment of science and humanity, it's something that's going to be paired with the very important commercial aspects.
Right. Now, speaking of space, drones, and regulatory policy, can you give us an overview of the Trump administration technology priorities? What have you achieved thus far? And what are your next steps on advising the president going forward?
Yeah. So I think the first thing we talked about, our first big pillar, is promoting emerging technology. So this is everything we've talked about with drones, with autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, quantum information sciences. These are all areas where we want to ensure American leadership in these particular technologies. The second thing that we think about a lot, and our second pillar, is around skills, and more importantly, we call it empowering Americans to innovate. And this is really providing the tools that Americans need to succeed in the 21st century economy. And above all else, I think the first thing is connectivity, and it's a real problem in America. While a lot of our cities are very well connected, a lot of our rural areas are not. There are actually 23 million Americans who do not have access to high-speed internet. That is 39% of all rural Americans do not have access to high-speed internet. Changing that and providing that connectivity can be incredible for those communities. These, provide opportunities for rural Americans to stay in their hometowns, build businesses there, be connected to the global marketplace. Two, it provides huge health benefits. The value of telemedicine cannot be understated. There's many states where in the entire state, maybe there's only one doctor who's a specialty doctor in a particular field. The ability for that doctor to be able to traverse hundreds of miles to visit all of the patients is actually extraordinarily difficult and expensive and challenging. So telemedicine can be very important. And I think I see it a lot with the parallels in Greece and the work that's being done here to try to connect a lot of the islands and some of the more rural communities to the internet. And this cannot be understated. And I think there's a lot of work being done at the State Department around this connectivity question, and it's something that we wholeheartedly support, because the more of the globe that we can get connected to the global marketplace, I think everyone kind of rises with it. Now, on the connectivity question, the other thing we think about very carefully is the rise of 5G and how the United States can be prepared for this new technology. And we kind of see it in sort of two categories. The first is the actual connectivity itself. So how do we deploy the 5G network? And for us, it's actually a very interesting challenge, because it's the first time that a network is actually going to be powered by small cells. So if you know, 5G is going to be actually a mesh network of pizza box size responders that are going to be all over the cities. This is markedly different than having just one large tower on the, just outside of the city or in the city itself. This provides a lot of sort of regulatory issues, because, cities now have to approve each individual site rather than just one big one. So we're trying to get through those hurdles. But the one that our office focuses more is more importantly, the technologies are going to be built on the back of the 5G network. I think it's very easy for most consumers to say, oh, I'm just going to have a faster cell phone. That's great and wonderful. But what's more important than that is everything else that can be done by these extraordinarily high-speed network. Everything from remote surgery to the way that our vehicles are going to be talking vehicle to vehicle, and all of the untold technologies are going to be built on this network. So for us, it's just as important to get folks connected, but even more important to actually provide that as a tool for innovators and other startup folks to be able to use that to build new businesses and new ideas.
Right. I want to see us now the big picture, the future of tech. Let's just go beyond connectivity. Let's assume it's out there and we enjoy it. At Tech Global this past April, and you mentioned that, and I quote again, that all technologies were once emerging, and without government support, they will still be.
Yeah.
Thus, you want to provide, you and your office want to provide that kind of support. For example, you prioritize the machine learning and autonomous systems inclusion in your annual R&D priorities memo. How do you see this effort going forward? AI, for instance, is poised to become huge, and generic AI as well, and other countries are investing heavily on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most pivotal roles of the U.S. federal government is to support basic research around the country. The U.S. spends approximately $156 billion a year on R&D, and a big chunk of that is being deployed out by agencies like the National Science Foundation to some of our greatest researchers at our universities. So for us, I think we have prioritized a number of next-generation technologies we want to ensure American leadership in, and one of the most prominent ones has been artificial intelligence. And as you know, there's some like to think of it as a global race between the United States and some of our adversaries in this technology. And I don't necessarily see it as a race. I see it as there are a number of countries around the world who recognize that that this particular technology can provide untold benefits to their people and to their citizens. And it is not surprising to us that they would want to invest in it. In the case of the U.S., I think we really want to take a whole of government approach to this technology. And what's unique about the U.S. system is that it is not a top-down industrial policy setting system. We have a R&D ecosystem that is one part academia, one part private sector, and one part federal government, all working in tandem to generate the next great technologies. So for us, we think very carefully about how the federal government can plug into that apparatus and be valuable. Part of the AI agenda is, one, providing the R&D dollars that are critical for developing this technology across all of our agencies. The second pillar is really thinking about the impact that AI will have on the American workforce. There's been a lot of studies and thinking and reports around the levels of displacement that will happen because of AI. For us, we understand that this will be an issue and something we need to think very carefully about. The President signed an executive order last month establishing the Council for the American Worker. in that particular executive order, he calls out artificial intelligence specifically twice. And we as an administration recognize that displacement and want to create a system in the U.S. where we can reskill and retool workers who may be displaced by this technology. And the third, which I think you mentioned, is really about removing the barriers to AI innovation. We want to create an environment in the U.S. where our greatest entrepreneurs and our greatest technologists in AI feel like the work that they're doing there can actually be deployed and commercialized in the U.S. We had a big breakthrough last year where the FDA approved the first AI-powered diagnostic in the history of the world, I believe. So this is for diabetic retinopathy. So this is a disease that affects millions of Americans that could go blind because of diabetes in the eye. Now you're able to use a completely AI-powered diagnostic to determine whether or not you have this disease, and if so, you can then go to the doctor. So for us, we want to think at all of our agencies, how can we create regulatory pathways for these novel technologies using novel tech to actually be deployed?
Right, lab to market is extremely important and key to go from research to actual consumer goods. Now, finally, because we are almost run out of time, we're on a stage in Greece, our beloved Greece. What opportunities do you see for United States and Greece to work together on tech policy, and what advice would you give perhaps to American and Greek companies who want to work together on the international technology stage?
Yeah, I think the first is we really need to take a couple things to heart. One is the importance of R&D, and these great discoveries obviously always begin in a lab, and you need to have the best technology sort of developments in order to get things commercialized. The second thing is continue to think very carefully about the regulatory environment. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have an environment where these technologies can actually be deployed, because you can have we even have the most amazing drones in the US, yet we have our drone companies going abroad to do their testing. They're in the UK, they're in Australia, they're not in America, and that's a problem for us. So encourage everyone who sort of works or interacts with government in that area to continue to kind of push for this idea of of a more open regulatory environment. And the third is really think a lot about the ecosystem. I think the reason why a lot of places in the US have been successful in the startup community is this sort of synergy between the academic community, the private sector, and academia all working together. And if you think about hubs like Silicon Valley, Stanford is there. If you think about places like Boston, Harvard, and MIT are there. And in all these areas, there's this incredible synergy between the academic community, where you have these bright minds researching, and then you have these innovative business folks working together. So as you sort of try to build your environments here in Greece, I think Thessaloniki is a great example, where I heard you have about 150,000 students here in this city. This is incredible untapped potential, and being able to kind of have those people in the city, not only thinking about their studies, but also ways that they can bring some of their businesses into the commercial sector is huge.
Well, that's a wrap, Michael. Thank you so much.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
Peace.